Hi there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. I want to invite you to a free class I'll be teaching over at michaels.com in May, on May 12th, and we are going to be doing an ink and wash of this carnation. And I let the camera roll while I was designing this project, so you could kind of get a heads up on what we're going to do in this free hour-long class. So the first thing I did was sketched on a watercolor greeting card, just using a regular pencil, and I'm using this book of vintage, copyright-free illustrations as my guide. I'm using this carnation illustration. These books are so awesome. They're from the Memories of a Lifetime series, and while I don't believe they're in print anymore, you can often find used copies of these books for a few bucks over on Amazon. And if I can find this one, I will link it up. But I think I have every one in the series. I used to buy them when they came out at Joann.com, or actually Joann Fabrics in an actual store. Oh my gosh, can you imagine? But they're great because they're wonderful for reference images, especially if you love those vintage illustrations, which I absolutely do. And they had quite a few different collections, and they come with a CD-ROM, so you can actually print out these pictures to use in your crafting. So I bought them to make cards with and also to use as reference photos. So I got my money's worth out of these books. So that's where I'm getting the carnation I'm sketching from. You can see it's that white one up in the corner. And if you're curious about my pencil, I just whittled the wood away from the lead, and that's one of the Derwent graphic pencils there, a very sturdy lead. And I like that because then I don't have to sharpen very often, and it just kind of keeps my sketching nice and loose and free looking, and I feel like more natural looking. So there I've got my sketch done, and now I'm using some waterproof pens to do my inking. And these are the Derwent line makers. Of course, you could use any waterproof micron type pen that you have. The nice thing about these pens and many pens is that they will not smudge under watercolor as well as under alcohol marker. And since I like to use both mediums, it's really a handy product to have in your stash. These are not refillable pens, but they do last a pretty good time as long as you follow a few rules. My first rule for working with these types of pens is to always work on dry paper. You can do the pen work after your watercoloring. That's totally fine, but the paper must be absolutely dry or you will ruin your pen. I think that water from the paper would mix up into the nib or something. It does something to the pen and then it never works right afterwards. So make sure your paper is absolutely dry before using any of these pigment-based waterproof pens. Also, try not to work on super rough paper. This is a watercolor greeting card. I believe it's either a Canson or a Strathmore. I find them to be very similar. It's not super rough. I wouldn't want to go ahead and use these pens on a very rough watercolor paper, or it's just going to wear that nib down. These nibs are relatively fragile, so you want them on like a hot press paper or a cold press that's not too rough. And I will opt for a fatter nib if my paper's a little bit rougher, and I'll just like use less pressure. So oftentimes if I'm using like Arches watercolor paper, even their cold press tends to be a little on the rough side, I'll use a larger nib, like a 5 or an 8, because I know I can kind of hold my pen at an angle and just use the corner of the nib and get a finer line, or I can use it more straight up and down and get a thicker line. I'm doing most of this with a 0.5 nib, which is, it's a fairly thick one, but I find that if I'm using smooth paper, I use a 0.3 mostly, and if I'm using like watercolor paper, I'm using a 0.5, unless it's a really rough one, then I'm using a 0.8. I also prefer kind of a more intense line, so if I'm going to be inking something, I want it to show. So I do tend to go with a little thicker of a nib. But you can find these in all different widths. So if you like a more dainty line, you can use a finer nib. Although I would recommend you pick a hot press paper, even if that means you have to make your own watercolor card. You just pick a hot press paper. Now, you don't have to do this on a watercolor card. That's what I'm doing for this class because we'll be able to finish it in an hour. Also, Mother's Day in America is coming up like 2 days after the class. So I'm like, well, let's do this on a watercolor card, because what mom wouldn't love to get a hand watercolored card from their child, right? So that's why I'm doing it on a watercolor card. But if you want to do it larger, do it on an 8x10 hot press watercolor block or something, that's totally fine. It's totally up to you. And yeah, I'm just using a plain watercolor card because I'm kind of lazy, and I actually really love working on those watercolor cards. It's just, it's fun. And then I have something to do with my painting when I'm done. I'll just mail it to somebody, and I like that. It's nice to do. It makes me feel good to think of somebody receiving that in the mail. And all the supplies that we're using, you can either substitute stuff in your stash if you have it, or you can find them over at michaels.com or in store at many of the Michaels locations. We are lucky we now have a Michaels in the town next to ours, so we didn't for the longest time, so that's kind of exciting. We're going to be using the Derwent Inktense products, and you don't need to have them all. You can use any of them. It's totally up to you. So dig them out. It's kind of exciting because Derwent is coming out with a 100 set, and that should be hitting stores this summer. And I saw in some videos from the 2 really big trade shows that went on earlier this year that they're doing some XL blocks, like the chunky graphite and charcoal ones. They're doing some chunky XL Inktense blocks. And I'm not exactly sure what colors they're going to put in those chunky blocks, but I'm very excited because I really love the Derwent Inktense line of products. And this class is actually sponsored by Derwent, so I really appreciate that. I appreciate that they're making this class free, and they've hired me to teach it, and Michaels for hosting it. It's just going to be a lot of fun. We have a lot of fun with these classes, and I urge you to sign up. Even if you can't make it when the class is live, there will be a replay. So by signing up, it lets Michaels know, it lets Derwent know that you enjoy these free classes, and it will make them more likely to have more of them, which is win-win-win, right? Free, hey, that's a win for everybody, and I get a gig, that's a win for me, and you get some free training, that's a win for you. So I decided I would use a couple of the Inktense products on this project. Now make sure your ink is dry, your Micron pen or your Derwent Line Maker pen is dry before you go onto this step. You can blast it with a heat tool or a hairdryer just to be safe. And then I thought it would save a little time by just using the Derwent pan paints to base coat in the undertone colors here. So I'm doing this, I mixed up kind of like a sap green color with like the mango and the teal green. And then I just used the mango for the, I think I might have used a little bit of sun yellow too for the bloom. I just wanted to get kind of a color all over everything. And you can use your pencils for that. You can pick up paint from the blocks, just like the pan paints. It's totally up to you. And now I'm going in with I think it's either called fuchsia or magenta pencil, and I'm adding in some shading into this flower. Now the good thing about Inktense is that once you have put down that layer and you've let it dry completely, you can go over, like I could go over and just add shading, and it's not going to bother or disrupt any of the color that's underneath. So I could just go in there with that pink and add that little blush of color and call it a day if I wanted to. I tend not to do that. I tend to keep fussing and overworking and fiddling. So, that's what's great about Inktense. You can keep fiddling over it and you're not going to disrupt what you've already done. So that's a good thing. Although it would be just as pretty to go in there just with the black and white ink to drawing and just put in a little Inktense in the shadows and blend it out. So really, I think it's a pretty versatile product. Now, if you're trying to decide what to use, here's my advice. Use what you have. If you have one of these products at home already, use those. But if you don't have any and you're considering what you might like, well, one thing you can do is, and I recommend this before you buy a huge set of anything, buy a couple individual pieces and see what you think. All of these products are available individually or open stock, which means you could buy a couple blocks, you could buy a couple pans, you could buy a couple pencils and try them out and see what you think. Like I said, Derwent is coming out with that 100 set of Inktense pencils this summer. So you may be like, I think I want to wait and get the full set. I can totally see that. But if you're not sure, it does not hurt to buy just a couple colors and try them out and see how they suit you. I will say that the pencils seem to be the most vibrant and the most transparent out of all these products. They're very vibrant, very transparent. The blocks and the pan paints I actually find to be a little bit opaque, and I would say the pan paints are probably the most opaque. Like the white pan paint is quite opaque, and the white Inktense block is quite opaque, but I don't find the white pencil to be very opaque at all. So it really depends on what you want. For a line and wash technique, I actually think the pencils are probably your best option because they're so transparent and it's not going to cover up any of your line work. It's not going to dull down any of the line work. But if you are someone who likes to work in layers and then you might want to have some opacity on top, and you can find all kinds of tutorials using Inktense products on my YouTube channel. Just search the product, go to my channel, and in the little search bar on my channel, it looks like a little magnifying glass on the front page of my channel, search the product you're looking for. Because the Inktense pan paints and blocks are very opaque. And if you're going to work in layers and you want that opacity, that's a much better option. whereas the pencils are much more translucent. So it really just depends on what you're after. Now I did decide to go in, and this is partially because I used the pan paints and they're a little bit more opaque. I did decide to go in with a little bit of pencil to kind of brighten things up a bit. I think if I had just used the Inktense pencils, everything would have been still luminous enough, but I was also really enjoying this and wanted to kind of go in and add a little bit more shading and more highlighting and stuff. So I'm using the Derwent Chroma Flow pencils for this because they're such a soft, waxy, opaque pencil that they really show up on top of watercolor or Inktense or other things like that. So they're a really nice mixed media pencil. And they're a really good option if you want that super soft pencil, but you've been frustrated with other brands breaking on you, or maybe you can't get them in your country or whatnot. So they are a nice option for that. They have a really nice level of opacity and softness. Great if you have arthritis or any sort of strength issues. They are a rather skinny barrel, so you may want to use like a little pencil grip on there if you struggle with those tiny barrels. But other than that, that's what you're going to be in store for this Michael's class coming up on May 12th. Check out the link in the video description to see what time it is in your part of the world, and I hope to see you live in class. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy crafting!